Before ES6 there were only two ways of declaring function. So I have some function and I will take a and b as the parameters. So this is the first way, and another way is function like this. So this will receive a comma b. So these were the two ways you can declare a function before ES6. This syntax is known as function declaration syntax. And this known as function expression syntax. Now with ES6 we have one more way. So we can say equal to, we add just brackets without anything, then add arrow, and then open the body of that particular function using curly bracket. Now we have two parameters, so we can mention them here. It's exactly same. So let's say I am returning sum of two numbers, a plus b. And I will call this function. So let me log that sum of 10 and 20. Comment this out. So you can see 30 is printed. So we have this correct way. So this is the another way. So this is another way of declaring function. This is known as arrow function syntax. So the advantage of this is if we have single statement, then we don't need to open curly bracket, and we also don't need return statement. So what we can do is we can directly mention that whatever you want to return directly after those arrows. So this is known as implicit return syntax of arrow function. What happens is you are implicitly returning. So when you don't add curly bracket and return statement, this works. But if you don't add, if you have a single statement here, then you can directly return that without writing those curly bracket and return statement. So this will exactly work. So let's say I am changing it to 15 and 20. You can see 35 is getting printed. So you don't need return statement and curly bracket. So it saves some extra lines of code, and you can write multiple statements. So advantage is that you can have more functions you can have in a particular file. So let's say get length function. So I will take a string and I will return just string dot length. You can see it's lot shorter. So now instead of get length, now get uppercase. So I have string, I will just use 2 uppercase. Now I can call these functions. Let's say get length, mic, that's some. So let's say just mic. So you will see length is 4 because it contains 4 characters. Now I can call get uppercase and I will pass the same thing. You can see we get uppercase. So we can create multiple functions with just a single line of code. So that's the advantage of first difference between normal function and arrow function. If you have only one statement, you can skip the return statement, return keyword and the curly bracket. If you don't have any parameter, you can just write this empty bracket. So you don't have to give any parameter if you don't have, but you need to write this empty pair of brackets. So that's required. So that is the important thing you need to remember. So this is the first difference with the normal function and arrow function. It makes it easy to write code, and you just use this like this function expression syntax only. So you just remove that function keyword and just use those brackets and add arrow here. So this is first difference. Second difference is with the arguments object. So let's say I have this sum function. Let me make this bigger. So let me comment that out. Let's say we have this sum function, normal function, and it accepts some values. I want to return some of these. So what I can do is I will do return a plus b plus c plus d. But let's say I don't know how many parameters, how many arguments I will be passing. So I might have n number of values I want to pass. So I don't know how many values I am passing. So how can you declare those initial itself? So you need some variable name as a parameter to access that. You cannot access that directly. So I have a lot of variables here. So this is A, B, C, D. So if I print this A, B, C, D, what you will see, you can see A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and D is 4. So these are getting printed. Now, this. So these are getting printed. But what about the next values? 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8. So what about next values? 5, 6, 7, 8. I cannot access that until I give some name E, F, G, H. Now I can access that E, F, G, H. So you can see all these values are getting printed. But I don't know how many values I am passing. So I initially cannot declare these variables. So other way is remove all of these variables and just use the argument subject. So here if I log arguments, this is a special object in JavaScript which contains all the parameters you have passed while calling that function. So you can see arguments, it's an object which contains all those parameters which you have passed. So now what I can do is I can use for loop. Let I equal to 0, I less than arguments dot length I plus plus. So I will declare some variable sum equal to 0 and I will add those variables plus equal to arguments of I, and I will return that sum here. And we can print this sum. You can see sum 36 is getting printed, which is sum of all of these numbers. If I just pass up to 5, you can see 15 is printed, which is correct sum of all of these numbers. So this argument subject is only accessible in function declaration syntax and function expression syntax. It's not available in arrow function. So now instead of this, if I convert it into arrow function, you can see we get error, arguments is not defined. So with arrow function you don't have access to argument subject. So if you want to access those, you need to convert this function into normal function. If you arrow functions don't have access to argument subject, so you need to convert it into normal function. So here you can just mouse over this, click on this, convert to named function. So now it will be converted to name and everything works fine. Now the third difference between normal function and arrow function is with respect to this. So how this works in when using normal function and when using arrow function. So to demonstrate that, let's say I have this function display and I will print this inside this and I will call the function. Let me add some text so we can identify. So you can see this is a window object. So this display function is outside, it's not inside any object or anywhere. So this will always refer to the window object. Now let's say I have user object. User, let's say countries, India, Japan, USA. So these are the countries and I have display function inside it. This object contains a display function. And if I print this here, user object this. Now I will call this particular display function user dot display. When I call this, you can see user object is actually the object which you have created. This object contains countries, property, and display function. It correctly refers to this particular user object. Why? Because we are calling this display function using user object. So before dot display there is user object. So it will correctly refer to this. This will always be the particular object which we are using to call that function. So now let's say instead of this I have set timeout function, and inside this I am printing. I will move this inside here, and let's say after 1 second I want to print what is the value of this. So I am still calling user.display. So what will happen? You can see when I refresh, this is window object, and user object which we are printing is now coming as a window object. It's not coming as the user object. Why? Because this is an anonymous function, a function which you are not manually calling. So here I am calling display function manually using user object, but this function will automatically get called after 1 second. So you are not calling using some specific object, so it becomes part of window. So this always refers to window. So whenever you are using set timeout, set interval, this will always refer to the window object. It will not refer to the actual object if you are using some object. So to fix this issue, I would just want to print the user object. I don't want this to be window object. So previously before ES6, to fix this issue, there were two ways. So for this particular function, we can use bind method. So bind method is available in JavaScript for functions. So you can change the context, or you can change this value using bind method. So let me print this here. Is outside, and print this. So you can see this outside correctly prints this particular object, user object. So I can use this value while binding function. So while calling bind, I can pass this, which is correct in this in display function. So now you will correctly see user object, which is the countries object. Without this bind, so let me remove this. So without this bind, it will always display window object. But when I add bind this, you will see that particular actual object which you have created. So this was the one way. Other way was creating a variable. Let's say self equal to this. So we store that this in particular variable, and then let me remove this, and here instead of this I will print self. It will correctly print this. So if I print self dot countries, it will correctly print the list of countries. So after 1 second, it prints those countries. But if I don't use self, I just use this dot countries, you will get undefined, because window object does not contains the countries property. There is nothing within the in window object with countries name. So previously with ES5 you have two ways. You can use bind method, or you use this self variable. It works, but there is a simpler way with ES6 using arrow function. So you can convert this normal function to arrow function. Now you don't need this. You can just say this dot countries. When I save, you can see you correctly get the actual array. So when using arrow functions don't have their own this binding. So it takes context or this binding from where that function is defined. So this set timeout is defined inside display function. That's an in display function. This refers correctly to the user object. So this dot countries will correctly print the countries. If I print this, it will correctly print that particular object, because arrow functions don't have their own this binding. So arrow functions takes the context of where that function is defined. So this is defined inside the display function, which is part of user. So this will always refer to the user object. That is important to understand. So let's say in index.html, I have a button. Click me, and I will add an event handler for this button. So let's set the top. We'll add some ID btn document.get element by id btn add event listener. So I am adding click event listener. So when I click on that button, I just need to display something. Console.log, you clicked the button. So now you can see here click me button is there. So when I click on this, you correctly get, you click this button. And if I print here this, what it prints. So let me clear this again. When I click this, you get the actual button which I clicked. So this always refers to the actual button. I am adding event listener to the button and I am using normal function. So whenever you are using normal function, this will refer to the actual button to which the event listener is added. But instead of normal function, if I use arrow function, then it will not refer to the button, it will refer to the window, because arrow functions don't have their own binding. Where this event handler is added, it's added in the window. So when I refresh, when I click on this, you can see you get the window object. You are not getting the actual button, you are getting window object. So you need to remember, whenever you are using arrow function or normal function, you need to think whether you need this or not. So if you are using this in any function, don't use arrow function if that's the your requirement. Otherwise you can use the normal function. So if you always want button to be the actual event handler, so you, when you want the button to be clicked and this should always refer to button, use normal function. So in this case you will correctly get that actual button which you click. So arrow function don't have their this binding. It refers to the context where that particular function is defined. So this is very important. So this is a normal function. Inside this we are using set timeout. So these arrow functions don't have their this binding. So you correctly get this. So you correctly get this dot countries will correctly print that country. But without this arrow function, you need to either use bind method or you need to use that self variable which you can use. You can see you correctly get the user object.